Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a premier field engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion will focus on Intune, specifically role-based access and scope tags, how they're used. Intune, again, being part of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So in terms of agenda, here's where we're going. First, I want to talk about what role-based access is, follow that with what scope tags are, why we care about both, and then we'll dig into it, show how they work, explore them a bit, configure them, and then show you actually these pieces working. So as we get started, just say up front, right? This is a really simple discussion in some ways, but it's also really complex in others. And what I mean is implementing scope tags, implementing role-based access is not difficult. But making sure that you implement it the way that is sustainable for your organization is really important. And that's where the difficulty can get to be, trying to plan this out and envision the different ways in which you might want to use these capabilities is really important, right? So what I'm going to show you is simple, right? Show you a few examples as we go along. When you think about using this in your environment, think about how the different twists and turns might be for how you would apply what you're going to see. All right, so what is specifically role-based access? Well, role-based access is all over the place, these days with Microsoft products. And one place certainly where role-based access front and center is in Configuration Manager. There's Azure role-based access. There's role-based access in many places. Role-based access, wherever you encounter it, is really all about managing access. Who has access to do what particular things, right? You'll see some of the roles below, but essentially roles will give you granular permission, the ability to granularly assign permission to users that need to have that particular capability. So in roles, you have two groups of roles. You have built-in roles, and you see those on the screen. Built-in roles, two types there. So Azure AD roles, and specifically Azure AD roles that allow Intune access. You see those. Then there's Intune roles that specifically exist in the Intune arena that you can configure different capabilities on. And we give you these roles as hopefully a way for you to quickly leverage technology that you or limiting and scoping like you need to, but also as a boilerplate that you can learn from, if you will, and create your own custom roles. So we do support custom roles as well, and you'll see those as we go along. So what are scope tags? So we talked about roles. What are scope tags? So scope tags work either independently or along with roles to manage what objects a given user can access. Think of it as a way to filter the view in the Intune console. So let's do it for those of you that are in a config manager background. We have the same kind of thing in config manager, right? We have the ability to define the capabilities that a user can have as they use config manager, but then we also have the capability to define a scope in config manager. The scope is that padlock that exists all throughout the console. So the two work together in config manager. And then you can also use collections in config manager. Well, similarly in Intune, you have the role that you can build and define, and then you can assign scope tags to define what shows up for a given user that is using the Intune console. You'll see all this come together in a minute. So why do we care? Why do we care about role-based access? Well, security. Being able to know that you can give rights to the Intune console, but that the admins won't be able to do beyond what their particular role allows them to get done. And same thing for scope tags, right? Scope tags help you organize your environment so that you can have the view that you want and have people working on the devices and the objects and so on that you want, right? You can organize in terms of locations, business function, whatever, right, as you need. And then I put in here the idea of single versus multi-tenant. So here's my thought on that, where this comes from. So I've worked with customers that have used other products for mobile device management, and they had the need to segment, maybe point of sales devices, maybe point of sales admins, maybe cash registers and admins for the cash registers, or whatever, right? The way they did that was they would stand up a unique instance of this third-party software to deliver management uniquely for those types of devices. Well, you're not going to want to do that with Intune. There's reasons that even if you could, which you can technically, but even if you wanted to go down that route, there's reasons that it's not a favorable way to go. And so you can achieve that same kind of multi-tenant experience within a single Intune tenant by using a combination of role-based access and then specifically scope tags. So this is really important to understand for those that are in that kind of scenario, right? Okay, so requirements for role-based access, for scope tags. Really, there's really no requirements to speak of. Obviously, you have to have Intune. Obviously, you have to have users and things, right? That goes without saying. The biggest requirement, bar none, is planning. Plan this thing, right? The thing you don't want to do is get down the road halfway through implementing something like this to realize that there's an unintended configuration that you hadn't thought through, right? Now, you can recover from that. It's not that you can't. It's just there's work involved with untangling things once you get through this, right? And then the other thing is, you'll see in a minute, there are groups that you will use to assign membership for roles and to associate scope tags and different things that you'll see in just a minute. All right, so to try to picture this and how it works, right? This concept is not difficult, but whenever I first was thinking through it and trying to understand it myself, it took a minute to kind of line this up with how things are associated, and especially coming from the config manager background, it helped a lot, but still, it took a minute to try to understand it. So the way this works is at the center of all of it, you have a role. This is either a default role, a custom role, however it is, right? Then, so this role is going to define a unique set of permissions that a given user can take advantage of. So once you define this role, you then have to say which users are allowed to participate in this permission level. So that's where you would have role members, right? So this is a group of users that would then be aligned to this role. You can add more users to the group, take users away, whatever you want to do, but then they will have the permissions associated with this particular role. Well, so let me fast forward a little bit. Whenever you actually build a role, the role doesn't do anything at all until you assign it to different places, right? So there's three places, three things. When you're assigning a role, there's three areas that you can plug in different configurations. So the role members is one. Then there's a scope under which the members of this role can apply their permissions. So this one's interesting, right? Because this option here and scope tags kind of are the same thing, right? So whenever you're doing role-based access, you may not actually want to filter to only allow the admin to see certain devices or certain objects, right? Well, if you don't want to filter to only allow seeing certain objects and so on, then scope tags, you don't really want them. You don't need them, right? So, but maybe you want to only allow admins that are in this group to have ability to perform their permissions on certain devices. So here in the scope, it's the scope of devices that members of this role are able to work on, right? And so you can use this scope group, if you will, to limit the range of devices that members of this particular role can act on. Well, scope tags do the same thing, right? Scope tags can be applied to devices. They can also be applied to objects that you create, so apps and policy and profiles and so on, right? So here you have kind of two choices or two options to arrive at the same goal. So you can leverage a group to scope to the devices, or you can choose scope tags, or you can do both. In my example, I do use a group to filter the list of devices. I also employ scope tags. You don't have to use both. So if you're going to use scope tags, the thought might be that you don't limit here at all. So you might go through the wizard and just leave the wizard to where there is no scoping. It's applied to all devices because you know your filtering is going to come in with scope tags, right? So that's where, again, we have both because both serve different purposes and we need both. But if you're going all the way and using scope tags, you have a choice which one you want to use. All right. And then finally, we have the third one, which is the scope tag. So you first define a list of your scope tags, and then you can apply your scope tags, again, to objects, to devices. So here I might have a scope tag of HR, and I've applied HR to this device, and this device, and this device, and this object, and this object, and this object. But these three, I don't have that tag, nor do I have it on this device. And so I associate the scope tag with this particular role. And so the users that are permissioned to use this particular set of permissions in this role will then also inherit the scope tag. And so they will only be able to use these permissions on objects that have the same scope tag. So these members can see these three objects, but these three won't even show up in the console. The members can see these three devices, but this fourth one won't even show up in the console, right? You'll see that in a minute as we go through some things, okay? All right. So that said, let's actually pull in the device management console and walk through how we go about configuring these things. Right now, this is, so we have two consoles. We have the Azure portal console, and we have the device management console. You can do what I'm about to do in both consoles. This one, the device management console, is where we would suggest you be focused today. And so the way this looks will be a bit different than the Azure portal console, right? But here we go. So I've got the device management console open. So I want to go down to the role-based, I want to focus on role-based access first. I want to go down to where I can see the various roles, and that's under tenant administration. And so then you see roles, right? So the first thing is we show the Intune roles and the Azure AD roles. And basically these are links to documentation to kind of describe what these roles are a bit and help you understand the difference between Intune roles and Azure AD roles. Both of Intune roles and Azure AD roles, identity is fully based on Azure AD anyway, right? It's just the scope of where these roles can actually do things. Okay, so I want to select all roles and see the list of Intune roles that are out here by default and what I can do. So here's, all of these are built in, right? Now you do see a few custom down here that I'll get to later, but all of these up top are built-in roles. So if I want to understand what a given role is configured to do, like help desk operator, I can just click on it and I can go to properties and then scroll down and see the permissions that are associated with the particular role, right? Now, the idea is maybe you will need to have a role that is very similar to one that already exists, but it's not exactly a match, right? So certainly if you have a built-in role that meets your needs, use it, right? It's a bonus because you don't have to do anything else. But if very likely, you have needs that are slightly a little bit beyond or more limited than what a given default role, built-in role will provide, then certainly you can use that role effectively as a boilerplate to build your own. And that would be called custom roles, right? So whenever we're building custom roles, we really have two options. One is you can click create and build your role from the start all the way using this wizard, right? Or you can go in and find a role that is similar to what you want and just click the three dots and select duplicate. Both of those actions take you to the same wizard. The difference is whenever you're starting with a brand new custom role, not based on anything else, you have to build everything into that role yourself, which that may actually be something you want to do so that you're intentional and you don't miss anything. Or if you duplicate the role, then the permissions that are part of the duplicated role are already defined in the wizard so that you can just customize what you need. So let me show you. So I'll just call that blah. And I'm going to go through and click next. And here are the permissions, right? So I've got yes, no, no, right? I've got audit data, yes. I've got corporate device identifiers, no. No for delete, right? Well, if I were to go and create a brand new role by, here we go, by selecting create, I'll just call it the same thing, blah, because I'm not saving it, and then click next. And the permissions that are here, same exact set of permissions. The only thing is everything is set to no. There is nothing that has been granted because this is starting from default, and the default is no permissions. You have to decide what permissions are allowed, right, when you do this. So that's creating the role, and we'll see more about creating or working with the role here as we go forward, right? But that's creating the role. Now, let's talk about scope tags for a minute. So same place in the Intune console, tenant administration, and under roles, we're going to have scope tags. So scope tags are basically a label. You have a default scope tag, and then you have any of the custom ones that you create. So every object that you have that can accept a scope tag in Intune will have the default scope tag by default, unless it has a specific scope tag, right? So whenever I were to, when I assign the scope tag Seattle as an example, then the default scope tag goes away, and only Seattle is there, right? Because that Intune then knows, hey, I want to make sure this object is only visible in Seattle or in one or two of the scope tags that are out there, right? So this is really just a label at the end of the day. Now, it is just a label, but building the label by itself doesn't help you, right? You have to associate that label with the users, with the objects that you want to be visible by those users. So there's a couple of different ways you can do it. You can go to every object that supports scope tags and assign on the object, which you need to do. There's also, whenever you build a role, as you'll see, one of the options in the assignment there is to associate a scope tag. But then here, as you build the scope tag, you might say, hey, I know that this scope tag needs to be applied to all users in a particular group, or all devices, in a particular group, right? So I might have a group out there that defines Seattle devices, and I want the entire group of devices to be assigned the scope tag, instead of trying to go individually to an object or whatever the case may be to a device and try to assign it. So here I've got a group that every member of this group, which you'll see that group in a minute, is going to receive this scope tag. In the same way, every member of this group is going to receive this scope tag, every member of this group, right? And so these are devices. Again, you'll see this in a minute. We'll come back and see these groups that these are assigned to. But that's effectively how you take the scope tag and you assign it to devices. Then there's other ways that you can take the scope tag and assign it to individual objects if you like. All right, so let me get this out of the way for just a moment. Actually, before I leave, I want to make sure I'm very clear on something, because again, there's lots of moving parts here, and I want to show you what I mean. So yes, absolutely, these are scope tags. You can assign them here just like I showed you, but that's not the only way you can assign them. I mentioned you can assign them to objects, and then I think I implied that you could not assign it directly to devices. You can, right? This is a convenient way to be able to do the assignment, but realistically, you could build the scope tag, not assign it to anyone here, and then still be able to use it. Let me show you. So if I go over to devices, I think I also said something else that I didn't intend to say, but let me clear it up. So if I look at all devices, so I can go into a device, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit just to clarify, and then I will see the scope tag right here, right? So one scope tag is selected. So if I go in here, I can select whatever scope tag I want. So I have Seattle selected because this device is actually in the group where I assign the scope tag. So I can do it in bulk, and that's a convenient way, right? Tangent here. So I had a customer I was talking to about this ask me a question: can they assign scope tags to autopilot devices so they receive that tag as they autopilot? The answer is yes. The only challenge there would be knowing what purpose a given device is going to serve at the autopilot stage. You can assign scope tags to it all day, right? Through the group, directly, whatever. So here's a list of the available scope tags, but here's a list of the scope tags that are assigned. And so the thing I wanted to be clear about, actually, I think I said it correctly, but just to be sure, when you assign a custom created scope tag, I said every object has the default scope tag assigned to it by default. That's true. When you assign a known scope tag, the default scope tag is no longer assigned. Here's an example of that. So this one I did assign by group. It has Seattle as the scope tag. Another device that I've not factored into scope tags at all is this Android device that I have, right? So if I look at it, it still has a scope tag assigned. It's just default, right, down here. As soon as I assign a real scope tag, default goes away. So I'll just quickly do this and save it. So I'm going to select it. And so now I have both, right? And so default, I can remove this. But if you do it automatically through a group or whatever, it will only leave that one scope tag. Anyway, so I'm belaboring the point here, but I just want to make sure that this is understood and clear about how this works. I'm going to remove this. And good. Okay. So now I will pull Intune out of here, and we'll get into it a little bit more. So in terms of actually seeing how this works, I want to take you first through my RBAC configuration, and then take you through the scope tags. And so let me pull back in the Intune console. Here I'm going to log in with a number of different users. Intune console first, please. There we go. Keeps opening on my other screen. All right. So I'm going to start with RBAC. I'm going to log in with a couple of different users to explore this as we go along. But let me start with users here. And so I have a user. This is the RBAC portion of the demo. So I should have called this RBAC, but I didn't. I called it scope tag demo user. So here's a user that I created specifically for demonstrating RBAC. And it's this name, scope tag demo user, right? Now, a word about users. So if you're going to assign an Intune role to a given user, then you need to make sure that a license, an Intune license, is assigned to that user. Otherwise, they will not be able to use that Intune role, right? Kind of goes without saying, it's kind of implied, but still, just want to call that out. And also, I'll call out kind of a tangent. If you're building a new user and assigning a license, that, in my experience, usually happens really quick. Sometimes it may not. So when I created the users I'm using in this demo, it took me, I think, if I remember right, a couple of hours later that the Intune license finally was assigned. Now, I'm recording this video at a time of COVID-19, and so the systems that host Intune and Azure are probably loaded more than they are normally, and so that may explain some of the delay. Don't know, but if it doesn't happen immediately, don't get alarmed. You can always go and see whether you have the license assigned on a given user. In fact, let me show you that real quick. So if I go into my user, I can look at licenses, and I will see the licenses that are assigned and active. So if I see them here and they're assigned and active, should be good, right? But just be aware. So I have this user. Now, I'm not going to assign the user directly to my RBAC configuration. So instead, I've got a group that I've configured, and this one I did title correctly. called it RBAC. Let's go down to it, or RBA. There we go. So RBA demo. So if I go inside this group and look at members, you will see this account that I just was showing you, scope tag demo user. Right? So my user is in the group, and I'm going to actually assign the group to my role. And so let me go back to tenant administration here and go under roles and then look at all roles. And then here I've just used policy and profile manager, right? So I'll show it to you. Under assignments, here's the name of the assignment. So you do give your assignment a name. And here's the properties. So I've got it assigned to RBA demo. That's the group I showed you. I have not scoped to any groups. I'm letting all users be the included scope for that. All users, all devices, could be whatever. Here's where I'm doing the membership scope. So again, this ties back to the graphic. Members that have this role assigned scope where this role can be leveraged, right? So all users default. I didn't change anything. And then I don't have any scope tags assigned, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign out of my console, right? So let me sign out of my full admin user, sign out. And then I'm going to sign back in with my demo user here. So if I type this right, I need to somehow not have such a long list of things to type here, but either way, here we go. And if I got that correct, and I did, okay, good. Signing in. Now, so I'm loading up just like normal, right? And so this user is a part of the policy and profile scope, which means that this user should be able to access things related to policy and profile, right? So it all looks normal, really, right now. But if I go in and I look at other things that this user should not have access to, like apps, look, no access, right? Or if I go in and I look at endpoint security, again, no access. You even see an error pop up, right? If I go and look at, I don't know, look at users or whatever, right? It's going to pop some things up, but you need to be able to see users to assign them to role-based access or to policy and profiles and so on. So that's a reason there. If I look under tenant administration, no permissions to certain things. Now, I will have permissions to some things, like if I want to see what permissions I actually have, I can see that, right? Here's a list of all the permissions that I have by being a member of the role that I'm a member of, right? Now, the user may not know they're part of any given role, but this is a way to see, hey, do I have access to see X, Y, or Z, right? So what if I go into the devices section, because that's where the policies and the profiles are located. I can go look at all devices, but I don't have rights. So it doesn't show me anything, right? But notice, look at this. I don't have rights even here, right? Don't have rights even here. Now this is interesting. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, right? So we don't see anything here at all. We don't have rights, right? But if I go under Windows, right, I don't see devices here. I don't have rights, but I certainly can go under compliance policies, and I do see my compliance policy. I can go under my configuration profiles. I see my configuration profiles, no problem. That's the area that I have rights to be able to go do some things, right? So that's kind of how it looks to the user if they are participating in Intune with a lower rights account. Now, one call out in Config Manager, as an example, whenever you put in role-based access, the console itself will change so that you don't see nodes that you don't have rights to. Right now in Intune, that's not true. You can see the nodes. You can go see where it says no access, right? Don't know if that will change in the future, but as of this recording, that's the way that it is. All right. So let me sign out of my RBAC demo here and sign back in with my user account so that I'm back to full admin and we can look at a couple of things. Okay, so now I'm in the Intune console. So now shifting over to scope tags. So I'm going to work you through the same example and how I've got it configured, and then we'll look at the response and how things work. So I'm going to go under users. I have 3 users defined to show you how scope tags actually work. So I'm going to call it scope tags, and there's 3 users here. There's scope tags, spread it out, field text admin, scope tags, point of sales admin, scope tags, Seattle admin. So as you can imagine, I'm trying to create a scenario where I might have users, in this case 1 per, but users that might need to do administrative things in different areas. Point of sales being 1, field text being another, Seattle admins being a regional kind of need, right? Well, I'm going to ultimately assign these users to a role that I've created custom for working in that particular focus area. Before I do that, though, I need to go and, again, users need to have licenses assigned. Don't forget that, right? Because I actually spent an hour wondering what was wrong before I realized I didn't assign the license, right? Okay, so I'm not going to assign the role to a user. I'm going to assign the role to a group. So let me go look at groups. So if I go to groups and I put in the same thing, scope tag, all groups, what did I do? Oh, that's what, scope tag, there we go. So I have 3 scope tag users, but look, I have 6 scope tag groups. Why? Well, look at the group names. Here, first is the scope tag demo group for field tech admins. Those are the users that will be able to use this particular set of rights in the group. All right. But I also am going to be scoping the field of devices that particular role can be used against. So I'm going to have one for devices too. So let's look at it. Field tech admins. The members is 1, my scope tag field tech admin user. Then I'm going to go back and look in field technician devices. And look, I don't have anyone in here on purpose, right? Just to show you. So no members, no devices have been added to this group. So let's go back. Right, scope tag point of sales admins. Here I have the point of sales user account right here. Go back and look at the devices, point of sales devices, and I do have 1 iPhone as the member here, right? And then finally, going back to scope tag Seattle admins, I do have 1 admin in here, right here. And then going back to devices, I have 3 devices in here. Have the iPhone plus 2 more. So this iPhone is actually scoped. It's to 2 different roles. Okay. Another way of saying it is it will show up under 2 different scope tag kind of scenarios. All right. So now that I have the groups, what I need to do is go through and assign all of this to my role. So I'm going to go back into tenant administration. I'm going to go to roles, and specifically, I'm going to look at all roles, go down to my scope tag demo, blow that up a little bit, make it wider. Okay, so go down to my role. So here's point of sales. So point of sales, whenever I go through my assignment, so I haven't actually limited any rights. I've given every single right that's out there because I don't care, right? For this, I'm allowing them to have full rights. I just want to show the scope tag scenario. So I have created an assignment of this role already to my point of sales admins, but there's 3 things I put into it. So let's look at the assignment. The first thing is the members who will receive this particular role. And that's my point of sales admins right here. Now I'm scoping to the devices that my point of sales admins can see. And I'm using this group to specify the devices. If you'll remember, point of sales has 1 device in it, an iPhone. Now, I'm using the scope group. I'm also using the scope tag. I don't have to use both. I can use one or the other. I could completely eliminate this and use my scope tag, and I'll still have the same net effect, right? And then I have my scope tag, iOS point of sales, being assigned to those that are using this role, right? All right, so the admins in this role are part of that scope tag, and they can see objects and devices with that scope tag. So let's look at field tags. So same thing, I haven't limited the rights at all. If I go through, though, here's my members who will actually have the rights in this group. Here's where the group will be able to see. In this case, there will be no devices, and then here's the tag that's associated, and then back to Intune and look at all the roles. Here's my scope tag for Seattle admins, and look at the assignments here, and same thing. So I have my Seattle admins, my Seattle devices, there's 3 devices, and my scope tag, right? So the best way to go through and see this is to log in with these accounts and actually show you what it looks like. So let's log out, and I'll log in with each one. So signing out of this one, and let me log in if I can type this right with, I'll start with field text, scope tags, and I immediately spelled it wrong, field technician, admin. Okay, if I type that right, and I did, good. So I'm going to sign in. Good, and the console opens. Now, we can look at this, we see some different things, and all the permissions are completely fine, no issue. I can go into anything I want, right? Nothing is going to be blocked for me. But what is going to be different is a view of the devices, right? Now, look, this is interesting. So I can see that there are 4 devices enrolled, but when I look at all devices, I see nothing, because none of those 4 devices have any scope tag associated with them that would allow me to be able to see them, right? So I have no limitation on rights, but I don't have any devices that I can do anything to, right? So effectively, it's not a workable user scenario, but you see that, right? So let me sign out of this one. Oh, I forgot to show you one thing, but I'll show you on this next one because it applies the same way, right? I've already shown it to you, so let's go in. Scope tags, point of sales, admins, or admin. There, did I type it right? Yes, so far so good. Did not type the password correctly. Now I did. Okay, so same thing. Now the first thing I'm going to do, because I forgot to do it a minute ago and to show you, is, again, as a user, I didn't limit rights at all, but I can go into tenant administration, look at roles, and look at permissions and see my full list of permissions. These are the rights that I have that I can exercise, but this does not tell me who I can exercise it on. My scope tag or my scoping group will tell me that. And so here I have done a scoping group and a scope tag, so I can look at my devices. Again, I see all 4. But if I look at all devices, I see 1, an iPhone, because that's all that I have rights to see by the scope tag and by the scoping group, right? And then same thing, I'll just sign out of this and go into my Seattle admin. Scroll down, scope tag, Seattle admin, Steve Rack, Intune, standalone. Here we go, and let's see, tracker. Okay, I typed that wrong. I feel myself hitting the wrong key. Let me do this again. There. Okay, good. So here, same deal. I won't belabor the point, but here I can see all 3 devices that are in my scope. So 4 there, but all devices I can still see 3. Right. Now, let me sign out of this and sign back in to my full admin. I forgot to show you one thing. I'll show it to you in just a minute. I'm going to sign into my full admin. And just to show you, so you've already seen it, but just to show you, there are 4 devices, right? 4 total devices. You see it in the overview page, and now I can see it here because I don't have any scope tags applied. So let me go back. So that's effectively how scope tags work, right? Now, what I've shown you with devices, what I haven't shown you is with objects such as policy or profiles or apps or whatever, but it works the exact same way. Exactly. So the question might come up, okay, great, so that's how scope tags work. What if you're logged in with an admin or an account that has limited rights and you want to create an object? How does that work with scope tags? Well, that's a phenomenal question and glad you asked. So let's go do that. I'm now under my Seattle admin scope tag, right? And so I'm going to go create an object. Again, I'm not limited to permissions at all here, so I can do what I want. So I'm going to go create a new compliance policy. All right. Now, create policy. I don't have to go any further than right here. One scope tag is selected. Which scope tag is it? It's Seattle. Why? Because the user I'm logged on as is in the Seattle scope tag. If this user were part of the Seattle scope tag and the point of sale scope tag, there would be 2 scope tags here, right? You don't see default here because we have a defined known scope tag. And so the way this is built makes a ton of sense, right? So let's go to the config manager example for a minute. If you're logged into config manager and you're in a collection, if you are scoped to a collection level and you start at a custom collection called all HR servers, you're never going to be able to do anything on any server other than all HR servers. And any apps you would create, any packages you would create, any software update deployments you would create would automatically inherit the HR server scope in Config Manager, right? Because that's your scope. Same thing here. I am part of the Seattle scope. So the point of sales people in their scope, they'll never see objects that I create as a part of the Seattle scope because I'm not part of their scope, right? So this is just a way to help you create multiple objects or objects in your working capacity that don't impact anyone else. This literally is like your own world. Even though there's lots of other devices in here, it's one tenant, right? It's your own world within that tenant. Now, you as a Seattle admin could also see the point of sales objects that are created if they share a scope tag, right? And so there are some scenarios where you might want to do that. But again, hopefully that makes sense and that illustrates the point, right? Okay, so let me get rid of the Intune console. That's really it, right? Again, these concepts are not difficult, but they're really important to understand, how they work. So in terms of troubleshooting, there's really not anything to troubleshoot so much here, except to make sure that you're getting the views that you expect, right? It's either going to work or it's not. And typically, whenever I've seen it not working yet, it's because the back end hasn't processed something, and you can tell in the console where those are, like maybe a license assignment or something else. You can see in the console if scope tags are assigned to the right object and so on. In terms of tips and tricks, we talked about inheritance, that when an admin creates an object, that object, in fact, we just did it, is going to inherit the scope tags assigned to the admin, right? And in terms of roles, so Intune RBAC doesn't apply to Azure AD roles. So a way of saying that is what you do with the Intune role-based access doesn't apply to anything besides Intune. It doesn't go upwards to Azure AD or whatever, right? And the other way of saying that is Azure AD global admins are not required to be a part of the Intune administrator roles. You can be an Intune admin and not be an Azure AD global admin, right? So pretty probably inferred, but just wanted to call it out. So that's it, right? That's it. That's our tour of scope tags and RBAC. Hopefully, it's clearer to you. Again, whenever you're first dealing with the concepts aren't hard. When you're first dealing with it, it takes a minute, at least it did for me, to snap in, but that's what they are. Very powerful. Take a look at them and I think you'll find pretty significant value in it. So we'll wrap the session here, and we'll see you next time.